Imagine standing on the cold, mist-covered shores of 9th century England. The silence of the morning prayer is shattered not by a bell, but by a scream. On the horizon, the distinct, terrifying silhouettes of dragon-headed ships cut through the fog. For the warriors of the time, this was a call to arms. But for the women residing in the isolated, undefended convents along the coast, it was a signal of the apocalypse. We often romanticize the Vikings today, painting them as adventurous explorers or misunderstood farmers pushed to the brink. But there is a much darker chapter in the saga of the Northmen, one that is rarely discussed in popular media because of just how disturbing it truly is. It involves the brides of Christ Christian nuns and the unimaginable lengths they went to in order to protect their vows. History is written by the victors, but in this case, it was written by the survivors who were left traumatized by a violence so profound it reshaped the religious landscape of Europe. We are going to look past the glory of Valhalla and dig into the gritty, horrifying reality of what happened when the heathens met the holy women of Christendom. And be warned, the story of what happened at Coldingham Priory is not for the faint of heart. To understand the horror, we first have to understand the strategy. The Vikings were not mindless berserkers, they were calculated raiders. In the early Viking Age, roughly starting with the raid on Lindisfarne in 793 AD, the Norsemen quickly realized that Christian religious sites were essentially banks without guards. Monasteries and convents were filled with gold chalices, silver crosses, and silk vestments. But they held another commodity that was, in many ways, more valuable than silver or gold: people. Specifically, young, healthy, and often noble-born women. Nuns in this era weren't always peasants, they were often the daughters of kings and thanes, placed in convents for education or safety. This made them high-value targets for ransom. However, the Vikings weren't just looking for ransom. They were looking for slaves, or thralls. A convent offered a concentrated population of women with no armed defense. When the Vikings landed, they knew they could act with total impunity. The isolation that the nuns sought for spiritual closeness to God became their greatest vulnerability. One of the most terrifying aspects of these raids was the complete lack of common ground. When Christian armies fought each other, there was usually a baseline of shared morality, certain lines you didn't cross, or at least, you felt guilty about crossing. Churches offered sanctuary, nuns were sacrosanct. The Vikings, however, were pagans. They worshipped Odin, Thor, and Freya. To a Viking raider, a Christian nun held no spiritual authority. Her vow of chastity meant absolutely nothing to them. In fact, the very concept of a woman denying her sexuality for a dead god was alien and perhaps even offensive to a culture that valued fertility and strength. This ideological gap meant that the psychological barrier that usually protected clergy in warfare was gone. The Vikings saw these women not as holy figures, but as spoils of war. This dehumanization was the first step in the atrocities that followed. The nuns, raised to believe their bodies were temples of the Holy Spirit, were suddenly faced with men who saw them as nothing more than livestock to be claimed. When we talk about darker than you imagine, we have to address the reality of sexual violence in the Viking Age. It is an uncomfortable historical truth that mass rape was a standard feature of Viking raids. For a nun, whose entire life was dedicated to purity and virginity as a testament to her faith, this was a fate literally viewed as worse than death. Historical chronicles from the time, such as the Annals of Saint Bertin, described the atrocities committed against nuns. While medieval chroniclers often used euphemisms, the implication is clear. The Vikings would often assault the women right in the heart of the church, in front of the altar, deliberately desecrating the holy space. This wasn't just physical violence, it was spiritual warfare. By defiling the nuns in the sanctuary, the Vikings were asserting the dominance of their gods over the Christian God. For the nuns who survived, the psychological trauma was compounded by a deep spiritual crisis. Many feared that their forced violation had broken their vows and damned their souls, a fear that the church hierarchy of the time had to work hard to assuage. This brings us to the most harrowing and famous story regarding Vikings and nuns, the incident at Coldingham Priory. This event is recorded by the chronicler Roger of Wendover, and while some modern historians debate its total factual accuracy, it perfectly encapsulates the sheer terror the Vikings inspired. The year was 870 AD. A massive Viking fleet, part of the Great Heathen Army, had landed in Scotland. The Mother Superior of the Coldingham Monastery was a woman named Ebba, later Saint Ebba. She received word that the raiders were approaching and knew exactly what would happen to her and her sisters if they were taken alive. Ebba gathered the nuns in the chapter house. She told them that they could save their souls and their chastity, but only if they did exactly as she did. In a moment of terrifying resolve, Ebba took a razor and sliced off her own nose and upper lip. The scene inside the chapter house is the stuff of nightmares. Following their leader's example, the other nuns proceeded to mutilate themselves. They cut off their noses and lips, covering their faces in blood and gore. The logic was brutal but sound. The Vikings were looking for women to sell as slaves or to keep as wives. By disfiguring themselves, the nuns made themselves valueless as commodities and undesirable as objects of lust. They sacrificed their beauty to save their vows. When the Vikings broke down the doors of the priory, they were expecting trembling, beautiful women. Instead, they were met with a room full of bloody, mutilated visages. The sight was so grotesque that the Vikings, hardened warriors who had seen the worst of war, recoiled in horror. They did not touch the women. However, the Vikings were also vindictive. Denied their prize, they locked the doors of the convent from the outside and set the building on fire. Saint Ebba and her nuns burned to death, but they died with their vows intact. This story of nose cutting is actually where the phrase "cutting off your nose to spite your face" is believed by some to originate, though the context is far more tragic than the idiom suggests today. For those who did not resort to such extreme measures, or who were captured before they could flee, the reality was bleak. We need to talk about the Viking slave trade. The Vikings were among the most prolific slave traders of the early Middle Ages. Dublin, established by the Vikings, became the largest slave market in Western Europe. Nuns captured in England, Scotland, or France were loaded onto longships cramped, cold, and wet and transported across the sea. Many died on the journey from exposure or shock. Once they arrived in Scandinavia or the markets of Dublin, these educated, holy women were sold like cattle. They were stripped of their habits, their names, and their identities. A woman who had spent her days illuminating manuscripts or chanting Latin psalms would find herself doing backbreaking farm work in the freezing Norwegian winter, or worse, serving as a concubine to a chieftain. The transition from a bride of Christ to a thrall of a pagan warlord is a psychological break that is hard to even comprehend. You might be thinking, is this just stories written by monks who hated Vikings? Well, science backs it up. Modern DNA studies of the populations in Iceland and the Faroe Islands reveal a startling truth. While the majority of the male settlers in these regions were of Norse origin, the majority of the female settlers were from the British Isles. This genetic imbalance paints a grim picture. It suggests that the settling of Iceland wasn't just families moving for a new life, it was Viking men bringing with them boatloads of Celtic and Saxon women, many of whom were likely taken from religious communities during raids. These women became the matriarchs of the Icelandic people. They raised the children, ran the households, and, ironically, likely played a huge role in the eventual conversion of these pagan lands to Christianity. They kept their faith in secret, whispering prayers to their children, planting the seeds that would eventually end the Viking Age. The terror inflicted by these raids was so widespread that it entered the liturgy of the Church. A famous litany from this era is often quoted, "A furor Normanorum libera nos, Domini," from the fury of the Northmen, "Deliver us, O Lord." This wasn't just a metaphor. This was a desperate plea added to daily prayers because the threat was existential. The Church, which had been the pillar of stability after the fall of Rome, was shaking. The Vikings had proven that the Church could not protect its own. This fear drove a change in architecture. We started to see the construction of pencil towers or round towers, particularly in Ireland. These tall, stone structures with doors located high off the ground were designed as panic rooms. When the alarm sounded, the monks and nuns would grab their relics, climb into the tower, and pull up the ladder, hoping the stone walls would hold until the raiders got bored and left. The story of the Vikings and the nuns is undeniably dark, but it is also a story of defiance. Saint Ebba and the martyrs of Coldingham became symbols of resistance. They took the only agency they had left, control over their own bodies, and used it to deny their oppressors exactly what they wanted. In the end, the Vikings won many battles, but they lost the war for the soul of Europe. The very women they kidnapped and enslaved eventually Christianized the North. The pagan gods died out, replaced by the god of the women they had tormented. It serves as a brutal reminder that history isn't just about the movement of armies or the names of kings. It's about the human cost of collision between cultures. The nuns of the 9th century faced a horror that is difficult to imagine, but their legacy remains etched in the history books, a testament to the terrifying darkness of the Viking Age. The Viking Age is often celebrated for its exploration and martial prowess, but for the women in the path of the longships, it was an era of pure nightmare. The story of Saint Ebba is a stark reminder that sometimes, the greatest acts of courage don't happen on the battlefield with a sword in hand, but in the quiet, terrifying moments of impossible choices. What do you think? Is the story of the Coldingham nuns a factual historical event or a legend created to inspire? And if you were in that situation, would you have the courage to make the choice Saint Ebba did? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into the dark side of history fascinating, please hit that like button, it really helps the channel. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss out on the next untold story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.